Good evening, guys. In the previous class, we understood what is Spring Data REST. Spring Data REST is used to simplify our REST API development. We no need to create the REST controllers to perform CRUD operations with the DB tables. With the DB tables, without creating REST controllers, we can expose our data as a REST API. For that, we are using Spring Data REST concept. To use data REST in our project, we need to add the below dependency. Spring Boot starter data REST dependency. Then for our repository interface, we are using @repository REST resource annotation. @repository REST resource annotation we are using. When we add @REST resource, then our entity will be exposed and we can access that entity data by using get, post, put, delete requests. If you have a requirement to stop few methods in the REST API, then you can write this kind of configuration and you can disable some methods like in my API, I don't want to support put method and delete method. Like this, I can add them as unsupported methods and I can stop them. So like this, we can use Spring Data REST to develop REST APIs within fraction of minutes. So if you have the requirement to perform the CRUD operations on your data, then without writing the REST controller, without writing the business logic, you can expose your application as a REST API by using data REST concept. Are you guys clear with my point? Did you practice the data REST, guys? Did you practice data REST?
Yes.
Working as expected?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Now, today we are going to talk on REST API exception handling. Okay, REST API exception handling mechanism. Here, guys, in the REST API, we can handle exceptions. In the Spring Boot, we have the exception handling mechanism. Exception handling is one of the key feature in every development, one of the key concept, key component in every project development. Now we are creating several projects and we are accessing those applications. Whenever exception occurs in a project, our projects will be terminated abnormally. So exception, we already discussed in the WebMVC. Exception means unexpected and unwanted situation. Exception means unexpected and unwanted situation. Exceptions will cause abnormal termination of our program. Okay, guys. Exceptions will cause abnormal termination of our program. To achieve the graceful termination, we need to handle exceptions in our project. To achieve graceful termination, we need to handle exceptions in our application. In order to achieve graceful termination, we need to handle exceptions in our application. In Spring Boot, we can handle the exceptions in two ways. One is called local exception handling. Another one is called as global exception handling. In Spring Boot, we can handle exceptions in two ways. Okay. In Spring Boot, we can handle exceptions in two ways. What are the two ways? One is called as local exception handling, and the second one is global exception handling. So what is the meaning of local exception handling, guys? The exceptions which occurred in that particular controller, only those exceptions will be handled. If you go for local exception handling concept, if you want to handle the exceptions occurring in the whole application, then you need to go for global exception handling mechanism. Okay. Now I want to create one project. In that project, I want to implement exception handling. Okay. Steps to implement steps to implement exception handling. Good. So create Spring Boot application with a web starter. Create boot application with web starter. Create boot application with web starter. Create REST controller. Create REST controller with a required method. I want to create a REST controller with required method. Then create user defined exception class. Create user defined exception class and create exception info binding class. Create exception info binding class. Create REST controller advice to handle global exceptions in our application. Okay, guys, I'm going to create one Spring Boot application with web starter, and I will create a REST controller in that project. And in order to handle the exception, I will create one user defined exception class and create exception info binding class. So to the client, I want to send the exception information. To send the exception information to the client, then I will create exception info binding class and create a REST controller advice to handle global exceptions in our application. Now, let me create one API, file, new, starter project, 29, REST API exception handling. REST API exception handling. Okay, so it is a Java application with version of Java as 8. Click on next. Spring Boot version 2.7. Spring Web Dependency I'm selecting. Lombok I'm selecting. DevTools I'm selecting. So Lombok, DevTools and Web Dependency I'm taking. So now here click on next and click on finish. Click on next and click on finish. So with this, my exception handling application got created. Okay, so let me create one REST controller. So let me create it as new class, some customer REST controller. I'm keeping that in the REST package. So create this as customer REST controller. Now, customer REST controller. Now I'm making this class as a REST controller by using @REST controller annotation. Customer details, public string get customer. Public string get customer. So here I'm expecting customer ID as a parameter. This method I'm binding to a GET request. I'm going for get mapping /customer ID. Customer ID I'm expecting as a path variable. So for that, I'm writing one annotation called @path variable. Okay, this is my simple method. This method is taking customer ID as an input and it is returning get customer name. So based on the customer ID, I want to get the customer name. So here what I will do is if customer ID is greater than or equal to 100, let me return some dummy value. Let me return some dummy value as John. Suppose if the customer ID is not greater than or equal to 100, then I want to throw some exception. I want to throw one exception. Got it? So dummy value I'm taking here. If customer ID is greater than or equal to 100, I will return the name as John. If customer ID condition is not satisfying, then I will return some exception. Okay, guys, how to return that exception? Throw new exception. I'm returning that exception, customer not found. I'm returning one exception. I'm throwing one exception with a name called customer not found. Now here I'm writing throws exception. I'm writing throws exception. This is my REST controller. Okay. Now let me go and run this application. Refresh, run as boot application. By default, this application will run in the embedded server with the port number 8080. Yes, application started. Go to browser. Let's access our application in the browser. Localhost colon 8080/customer/121. Okay. When I send the request with the customer ID 121, that means my condition is satisfied and it is returning the customer name as John. Okay. Suppose if I send the customer ID as a 90, then I'm getting exception. What is the exception? Customer not found. Okay, guys. Now here, this is a REST API. So in the REST API, client server will be available. My REST API will be accessed by a client application. When client application accessed my REST API, if I send exception like this, will they understand anything? Guys, if I'm throwing an exception like this, will they understand anything? Will they understand anything? No. So it is saying that status code as 500. What is the meaning of status code as 500? It is a server problem. Actually, it is a server problem. Our client is giving a invalid ID. My application is saying that it is a server error, 500. Actually, it is a server error. Our client is giving the invalid ID. Client is giving the invalid ID. Is my application conveying that message to the client, or my application conveying that it is my application problem? Miscommunication. Miscommunication is happening. Client is giving the invalid ID, but my application is sending the status as 500. What is the meaning of 500? 500 means it is a client error, or 500 means it is a server error. 500 means it is a client error, or it is a server error. Client error or server error. 500 means it is a server error. But actually we know that it is a client mistake. Client is giving the invalid ID. So now in such kind of scenario, we need to handle that exception properly, and we need to give proper information to the client with the proper status code. We need to give proper information to the client, and we need to give proper information to the client with the proper status code. Now, in this scenario, what we will do is, we will create one exception class. I'm going to create one exception class in the project with a name called customer not found exception. I'm creating one class, user defined exception class I'm creating. For that class, I'm using the name as customer not found exception. It is extending the properties. It is extending the properties from runtime exception. Extending the properties from runtime exception. Public class customer not found exception. Extending the properties from runtime exception. I will write one 0 param constructor for that, and I will write one parameterized constructor also. This parameterized constructor will take string message. It will give that to our super. It will give that message to super constructor. Okay. What is the super constructor? Super constructor is runtime exception class. That means whenever we call this constructor, internally it is calling the runtime exception class constructor. So runtime exception class is available. So whenever we call the runtime exception constructor, it is calling its super constructor. It is calling its super constructor. What is its super constructor? Exception. So in the exception, that constructor is calling its super constructor. What is its super constructor? Throwable. In the throwable, whatever the constructor we are calling, that constructor will have the logic. That constructor will have a logic. Throwable, fill in the stack trace, throwable message, detailed message will be available. Finally, this constructor will be called whenever I am calling the customer not found exception constructor. Internally, it is calling runtime exception constructor. Runtime exception constructor is calling exception constructor. Exception constructor is calling throwable constructor. Throwable constructor is printing the exception stack trace. It is printing exception stack trace. Guys, are you able to understand how I am creating user-defined exception class? Are you able to understand how I am creating user-defined exception class? I'm creating user-defined exception class by extending the properties from runtime exception. I'm extending the properties from user. I'm creating a class by extending the properties from runtime exception. In that class, I'm writing zero param constructor and I'm writing parameterized constructor. In the customer REST controller, whenever the customer ID is invalid, now I will throw customer not found exception. Throw new customer not found exception with a message invalid customer ID. Invalid customer ID. This is the message I am giving. Now earlier I was throwing generic exception. Now I'm throwing a generic exception or I'm throwing a user defined exception. It is always recommended to throw user defined exceptions in the project instead of going for the generic exception. You got it? Whenever the customer ID is not available, then my application will throw customer not found exception, invalid customer ID. Okay, fine. Let us test this. Refresh, right click, run as boot application. Right click, run as boot application, clear the console. Go to the browser, customer/102. Yes, I'm getting the response. When the customer ID is 102, I'm getting the response as expected. Let me give the customer ID as some 87. Then again, what happened? It is throwing customer not found exception, invalid customer ID. But what is the status code we are getting? Guys? Status code we are getting as a 500. 500 means server problem or client problem? Server error. But actually, it is a client problem. So now, is this the right way? Is this the right way to handle exception in the REST API? Is this the right way to handle the exception in the REST API? Not the right way. Whenever the customer ID is invalid, we need to convey that message to the client. Okay. So for that, I'm going to create one more class that is called exception info. Why exception occurred? That exception information we need to convey to the client. In this exception info, I will write private string, exception code, private string, exception message, private string, local date time, exception log time, exception occurred, exception time, exception code, exception message. I want to send all this information to the client application. What is the code of the exception? What is the message? And what is the time when that exception occurred? So I will give it as code, message, and date. When it occurred. Now I want to convey this information to the client. For that, I'm taking one binding class. One simple binding class I'm taking. In that class, I'm taking three variables. One is a code variable that represents exception code. So DB exceptions will have one code. Okay. Web service exceptions will have one code. Validation exceptions will have one code. Like that in the project, they will decide what is the code that we need to use. Private string code, private string message, and what is the date when that exception occurred. I want to find out that. String code, string message, local date time. I want to identify this. Good. Now this is my exception info class. This class is used to convey exception data, exception information to the client application. Whoever is accessing my REST API, if some problem occurred in my REST API, they should understand the problem clearly. They should understand the problem clearly. Okay. Now I have created one exception info class. Now what I want to do is, in my project, whenever customer not found exception occurred, I want to handle that. I want to handle that. Okay. I can do that handling inside controller. If I do that handling inside the controller, that is called as local exception handling. When I do that exception handling within my controller class, then that kind of exception handling is called as local exception handling. So now I don't want to do that local exception handling. I want to go for global exception handling. To implement global exception handling, I'm going to create one exception handler, app exception handler. I'm taking a class with a name called app exception handler. So to represent this class as a global exception handler, I'm using one annotation called REST controller advice. If you are handling the exceptions in the normal web application, we will go for only controller advice. We'll go for only controller advice. But when you go for REST API exception handling, UI will not be available. If you want to display exception data in the UI, then we will go for controller advice. In the web application, we use controller advice. But today it is not web application, it is a REST API. So for the REST API, UI will not be available, business to business communication. If an exception occurs in my application should convey that exception to the client application. For that, we are going for REST controller advice. In this, we need to write one method. In this, we need to write one method. Public response entity. Why I am taking response entity? To convey my exception data to the client application with a respective status code. For that, exception info I want to send. Exception info I want to send. Handle customer not found exception. Customer not found exception. Okay. So let me take that as customer not found exception. CNFE. That is customer not found exception. Now I want to map this method to the exception handler. So what is the purpose of this method? This method is responsible to handle customer not found exception. Exception handler value is equal to customer not found exception dot class. Customer not found exception dot class. So in the whole project, whenever customer not found exception occurred, this method is responsible to do that. In the whole project, whenever customer not found exception occurred, this method is responsible to handle that. Now here, I'm going to create exception info object. Exception info is equal to new exception info. Now, for this object, I need to set the data. Info dot set code. Something like this code will be available for every exception in the project. Okay. And info dot set message. Set message. So customer not found exception is available. That object I got, then I will take customer not found dot get message. Okay. And info dot set data. I will take local date time dot now. So whenever exception occurred, that exception date also I will represent here. If you observe, I'm creating app exception handler. This app exception handler, I want to make as a REST controller advice because I want to make this class as a global handler. In my project, wherever customer not found exception occurred, then this method should handle that. Exception handler value is equal to customer not found exception dot class. In my REST controller, if ID is not matching, My REST controller is throwing customer not found exception. When the customer not found exception occurred, then this handler should handle that. So there is a method to handle that. Exception info is equal to new exception info. Info.set code, info.set message, info.set date. Now what I will do is new response entity body and status. What is the body? Info object. What is the status? It is a bad request. HTTP status dot bad request. Bad request represents 400 status code. 404 means resource not found. 404 means resource not found. 400 means bad request. 400 means bad request. Are you clear? Are you clear with this? Now let us run our application. Let us see what is the behavior. We can't see the status code in the browser. Let me go for Postman tool. Okay. My application is started and I will send a request for the REST controller with a valid ID and with invalid ID. Then we will see the difference. Okay. So get request 8080 customer/102 or 101. Click on send. Are we able to get the proper response with 200 status code? Are we able to get the proper response with 200 status code? Come on, guys. Yes, we are getting. Now, let me go with some 78. Click on send. Now, exception stack trace is coming. Proper information is coming to the client. So when I send a request with the 78, exception stack trace is coming or proper response is coming. Exception code, why exception occurred, when that exception occurred, 400 bad requests. When client see 400 bad requests, it is a client mistake or it is a server mistake? It is a client mistake. You got my point? Now, so earlier, this stack trace is better or this stack trace is better for the client? This stack trace is better for the client. Got it? Now see this exception handler class. Guys, are you able to understand? When I'm sending a request with the ID 102, I'm getting proper response as a John. I'm getting the proper response as a John. When I send the request with 87, then what happened? Am I getting exception stack trace like this, or I'm getting very good, beautiful response to the client? I'm giving very beautiful and meaningful response to the client with the proper status code. When you send the number as 87, I'm telling to the client, boss, exception occurred. Invalid customer ID. This is the time when your exception occurred, and that is a bad request. Invalid customer ID, I can process your request. Are you guys clear? How I have handled user-defined, how I have handled exceptions with user-defined exception class. So first I have created one exception class with a name called customer not found exception. That class is extending the properties from runtime exception. Public class customer not found exception extending from runtime exception. In my application, whenever I want to throw the exception, whenever some problem is there in my code, then I'm throwing that customer not found exception with a message, invalid customer ID. The same message coming here in the client response. Got it? So I'm throwing that customer not found exception with a message. Why the exception occurred? With the message, I'm throwing that exception. When I throw that exception, it will check in this whole project, is there any handler to handle this exception? Yes, I have created a handler to handle this exception. What is that handler? App exception handler. What is the handler available? App exception handler is available. How this class is identified as a handler? This class is identified as a handler because of this REST controller advice annotation. So as this class is acting as a global exception handler, then I'm writing one method in that class. What is the purpose of that method? that method is responsible to handle this exception. What is the exception? Customer not found exception. In this project, whenever or wherever, in this project, whenever or wherever customer not found exception occurred, then this handler method will be called. In this handler method, what I'm doing, I'm creating exception info object. This is just one binding class. This is just one binding class. It is used to set the exception information and exception occurred details to the client and send that information. Exception info is just a binding class. I'm setting the code, I'm setting the message, I'm setting the date for the exception info class. After setting the details, I'm using response entity. What is the purpose of response entity? It is used to construct response to the client. What is the response body? In the response body, I'm sending exception info object data as a JSON, and the response status code I'm setting as a bad request. What is the meaning of a bad request? Bad request means 400 status code. It is a client problem. So whenever you send a request with any other value, then you will get the response like this: invalid customer ID, at what date, what time the exception occurred, and exception status code. Suppose if you give valid ID, then valid response you are getting. Are you clear? Anybody having any questions on this exception handling? You can unmute and you can speak. I created one user-defined class as a user-defined exception class, and I created one binding class to set the details to the client, and I'm throwing that exception in my controller, and there is a handler class available as a REST controller advice. In the REST controller advice, my exception handler method available. In the project, wherever and whenever customer not found exception occurs, then immediately this handler method will be called. So that when the client send a request with valid number, valid ID, valid response will come. When a client send a request with the invalid ID, proper meaningful response will come with the proper status code.
Sir, in the exception handler class, we are putting that parameter, sir. Is it compulsory in the 14th line, sir?
Yeah, if you don't put the parameter, right?
Not here, sir. Not here. Exception handler, sir. App exception handler. 14th line, we are writing the parameter, no, sir. In the method parameter, handle CNFE. But already we are mentioning what is that exception in the 13th line, no, sir. Again, is it required, sir? Here?
No. Here, if you don't take this parameter, how you will get the exception message?
Oh, okay, sir. Okay, understand, sir. Thank you.
Got it. Here?
Yeah, got it, sir. Got it.
Yeah. I'm taking the object. Because of this object, I'm able to call the get message method, which is giving the message.
Right,
who is
sir.
telling that message? My REST controller setting that message to the exception class. This message I want to get in the handler.
Understood, sir. Understood. Thank you, sir.
Hi, sir. I have
whichever fields we have, let's say,
1 second.
using, we are having our ticket booking only, sir. Then sure, for all the fields in ticket Lombok class, should we mention this in info.set methods?
Yes, right. You need to do that.
Okay.
Hello, sir. We are setting the EX0011.
So this is a random code I have taken, sir, in the real
Yes,
time.
yes. Yeah. Normally, this is our wish, or
project will decide that. For database exceptions, they will give one code. For timeout exceptions, they will give one code. Okay. For validation exceptions, they will give one code. Category wise codes will be available.
Actually, in my application, I am seeing like this codes. So that's why doubt came. We able to implement like that, or we need to use a predefined code?
No. Project will decide the codes. When to use which code, project will decide that.
Oh, sure. Thank you very much.
In that scenario, what we need to do is, here in the not found exception class, right? You can take two parameters, message and code. The code also you can set it here. Message, comma, code you can pass directly.
Hello.
Thank you,
sir. Instead of taking a custom exception, directly we take a superclass exception. Na?
That also you can do it, but in the project, it is recommended to create the custom exceptions for the scenarios.
Okay.
Yeah. So in the project, suppose if you don't take the customer not found exception, like this also you can do it. But if exception occurs in the some other method also,
Okay.
it will become a generic, right?
Yes,
In the
sir.
project, at multiple places, this exception can occur. It is a superclass exception. I
Okay.
want to execute this method only when customer not found exception occurred.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why we are going to create the user defined exceptions for the scenario, so whenever this customer not found exception occurred, then only this method will be called. Here, if you throw generic exception, that will become a generic. Whenever exception occurred, then that exception hand here you need to change to exception dot class, and here you need to change to exception. So in which scenario this method will be executed now? In all the scenarios wherever exception occurred, then this method will be executed. It is a generic.
Okay.
It is a generic. I want to execute my code only when specific exception occurred. So that's why I'm creating a user defined exception and I'm throwing that user defined exception wantedly.
Okay. Understood.
Got it.
Another doubt is, sir, when exception occurred in service class,
no problem. This exception you can throw from the controller, REST controller, or from the service, or from the DAO also. My REST controller advice is there, right? This is global. It doesn't matter whether the exception occurred in the service class or controller class or DAO. Whenever this customer not found exception occurred, wherever it occurred, still this method will be executed. Even if that message, that exception occurred in the service class also, still this handler will be executed.
Okay, understood, sir. Means propagated.
Yeah, it will be propagated.
Okay.
Now, whenever exception occurred in the service you don't write the handling part for that. Simply, it will be propagated to controller. From the controller, it will go to this handler. That's it. If you want, I will change my code and I will show you. Okay. So let me add my service class. New service class, customer service. Let me keep this inside the service package. Okay. I want to make this class as a service by using @service annotation. I will make this class as a service class. Now here I will write a method public string get customer name by ID. So integer customer ID I will pass as a parameter. Whatever the logic is there in the controller, that logic I will implement in the service class now. If customer ID is greater than 100, return the value as John. If not, return the value, if not, throw the exception. Now what my controller will do? My controller will simply call the service layer method. Private customer service service. Okay. So here I'm going to return service dot get customer name by ID by passing customer ID. Okay. Now, where is the logic to throw the exception? Is it in my REST controller class or is it in my service class? Where is the logic to throw the exception?
Service.
Service is throwing the exception. Now refresh this. Refresh, right click, run as boot application. Clear the console. Go to this Postman. Let me go with the valid ID 121. Null point, okay.
Customer
I did not use
auto
wire. Yeah, so this is not injected. So let me go for auto wiring so that object will be injected. Clear the console 121. Am I able to get the response as John?
Yes.
Valid ID I am giving. When I click on the send, I'm getting the response as John. Let me give the ID as 12 and click on send. Am I getting that stack trace properly?
Yes.
Earlier, my controller method was throwing that user defined exception. Now, my controller is simply calling my service method. My service method is throwing that exception. Whenever we throw the exception in the method, first it will check, is there any handler available here? Do we have any handler available here? No handler available. Then it will be thrown to the method which called this method. Who called this method? Controller called this method. In the controller, do we have any handling logic for the exception? We don't have. Then it will go for global exception handler. In the global exception handler class, we have a method to handle that exception. This method will be executed. You got it?
Yes, sir. Got it, sir.
Yeah. So you can throw that exception from the controller, or you can throw that from the server. It depends upon your logic, right? When you want to throw the exception. So wherever and whenever you throw that customer not found exception, my exception handler will pick up that and will handle that and will send the data which we are asking that response entity to send in the body. This info object representing exception info, this exception info object data will be converted to JSON. That JSON data will go to the client, and which status code we should send to the client also we are setting as a bad request 400.
Understood, sir.
Clear. Good. Anyone having any other question? Yeah.
Sir, once go to exception handler class.
Yeah. This is my exception handler class.
Here can I write one more method response entity?
You can write one more method. Suppose, for example, in my project, products are available. Product not found exception. I can create a product not found exception. I can write one more method to handle product not found exception.
Sir, if I write only exception dot class,
where
in
that
this,
will, as I told you, if you write exception at class, will become a generic, right?
Both if I write in this, like class not found, file not found, and normal exception.
You can write only one value, right? It is not for multiple, only one. For only one exception, you can write this handler, not for multiple. Okay. If you want to handle customer not found exception, this is the method. If you want to handle product not found exception, then another method.
That's what, sir. Another method I will write. In that method, if I keep exception dot class like generic, then it will go to generic only.
It will go to generic. Let me check this. You are saying that you will write here as exception dot class, yes, and handle exception. Handle exception, and you are keeping that exception here.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Exception. Now here exception dot get message. We are sending that as a 22, or else let me give it as a 22. Okay. So yes, handle exception. This is one method, and this is another method. Which exception my method is throwing?
Customer
not found.
Customer not found exception. Now stop the server, right click, run as boot application. Clear the console. Go here, send 12. Is it going to generic one or it is going to customer not found?
Customer not.
How can you say that it will go to generic? Very clearly we mentioned that this method should be executed when the customer not found exception occurred. This method will be executed whenever generic exception occurred. So in this scenario, my service class is throwing customer not found exception. So then it will identify the handler which is having customer not found exception as a value. So it is not going to the generic one. If it goes to the generic one, code should come as 22. If it is go for the correct handler method, 11 is the code. So when I send a request with 121, valid ID, John is the response. If I give the invalid ID, we click on send, ID coming as 11. ID coming as a 11 means this first method is executing or second method is executing? First method is executing. Yes.
So if I throw any other exceptions, then generic will execute.
If you throw any other exception than customer not found, then this exception will be handled by that method, this method. Any generic exception which is not handled in our handler. Okay. Then it will go to this one. First, it will give the priority for the exception which occurred. If that handler is not available for that, then it will go for the generic one. Got it?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Next one, guys.
Yeah, so,
anyone?
If we are not going to write the REST controller advice, simply we are writing the controller advice, what will happen?
Controller advice, if you write controller advice, then what it will think is whatever that you are returning, it will be considered as a view page. Okay. I'm writing just controller advice now. So refer this. Now go to the console, clear this, right click, run as boot application. Send the request now. So in the controller advice also, we are getting the same response, right? But the thing is, whenever you go for controller advice, if you take the method return type as a string, then it will consider that as a view page. So if you want, suppose in the web application, you want to represent that as a view page as a response. In that scenario, we can go for controller advice and you can return string as a return type. So what is the meaning of string as a return type? It will consider that that string is a view page and that view page will be rendered to display the exception data. Some problem occurred. Please try again after some time. With that UI, if you want to go, then we can go for control advice. If you don't want any such kind of UI, then simply you can go for REST control advice. In this control advice also, if you are returning an object like this, that object is converted to JSON. If you take the string, then that will become a problem. So that's why simply we will go for REST controlled advice. When you go for REST controlled advice, there is no concept of UI. Everything is a B2B communication.
Okay. So REST controller advice is combination of controller advice plus
response body.
Yeah.
Good.
Instead of creating exception info object directly, that we can keep as a @auto.
This is binding class. For binding classes, generally we don't do auto wirings. Binding classes are nothing but these classes are having the instance variables, right? So these classes will have a state. So we don't do auto wiring for the binding classes. Generally, the classes which have business logic, for them only one object should be created. Then we will go for auto wiring. Okay. So exception info is a binding class. For every new exception, the data is going to change in the exception info variable. So we don't do the auto wiring for that. All right, good. Fine. Next one. With this, we understood how to implement exception handling in our application. So this is first my user-defined exception that I have created in the project. So this is my user-defined exception class. And I have created one binding class also with a name called exception info. It is used to send exception data to the client. And I have created one handler class also to handle the exception which occurred in the project. Whenever customer not found exception occurred, then this handler will be executed. And to throw the exception, I have taken one customer REST controller. If you give ID below 100, it will throw that exception because my service layer is there. In my service layer method, I'm checking a condition. If ID is greater than or equal to 100, then no problem. If ID is less than 100, wantedly I'm throwing one exception. Whenever exception is occurred, then my handler is handling that exception or not, we are able to check this. So like this, we can implement exception handling in the REST API. Guys, whatever the exception handling I have implemented here, is it a local exception handling or is it a global exception handling? Whatever the exception handling I have done, is it global exception handling or is it local exception handling? It is a global exception handling. How can you say that it is a global exception handling? How can you say that it is a global exception handling, guys? Come on. Controller advice. It is applicable for all the classes which are available in the project. So same method, whatever I am writing in the handler, same method can I write inside my controller also? Same method can I write in my controller also? If I write the same method in the controller, what is the problem? It will become local. So if customer not found exception occurred within this controller, then only that will be handled. So instead of going for local handling, we are going for global handling. I hope you got the clarity how to implement exception handling in the REST API. Okay, good. Perfect. And the next one, the important thing, theoretically that you need to understand REST architecture principles. What is the concept, guys? REST architecture principles. We are following REST API development from couple of days. Okay. So here first, we need to understand what is the full form of the REST. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. REST full form is Representation State Transfer. So here we are developing RESTful services. Representation State Transfer is the full form of the REST. Now, here guys, whenever we are developing the REST API, there are some architecture principles available that we need to follow. So REST architecture principles, representation, state transfer. So that is the full form of the REST. The first principle, we need to go for client server architecture. Whenever we are developing the REST API, there should be a concept called client server architecture. So whenever we develop a REST API, client applications should access our REST API. Client server architecture. When we develop one REST API, clients are going to access our REST API. Client server architecture. One application will act as a REST API. Another application will act as a REST client. B2B communication should be available. When you go for REST API development, we need to have B2B communication. That is called client server architecture. And second one is no state. No state or session management. We should not implement any session concept in the REST API. No state or session management. We should not implement any session concept in our REST APIs. So in the REST API, every request should be considered as a fresh request. In the REST API, every request should be considered as a fresh request. Your REST API should not remember any client credentials or any client information. We should not have any session management concept in the REST API. And third one is unique addressability. Third one is unique addressability. Unique addressability, nothing but every method should be having a unique URL pattern. You should not write multiple methods with the same URL pattern. Unique addressability. Every method should be binded to unique URL pattern. Now, map endpoints to HTTP methods. Map endpoints to HTTP methods. That means whatever the REST API methods we are creating, every method should be binded to HTTP protocol methods. Otherwise, client applications cannot access. Every REST API method should be mapped to HTTP methods. Map REST API endpoints. Map REST API endpoints to HTTP methods. And the fifth one, media representation. Media type representation. So here, REST API should provide the flexibility for the clients to decide data format. Now, I'm not asking only to send XML data. My REST API will not ask only to send the XML data. My REST API will not ask to send only JSON data. So my REST API will support for both XML and JSON. It is up to you whether you will send JSON data in the input or you will send XML data in the input. It's up to you whether you want XML data as output, whether you want JSON data as output. So here, REST API is having consumes, produces, and it is supporting for content type and accept. Consumes and produces will represent in which format you want to, in the REST API, in which format you want to accept the data. Producers will represent in which format you want to send the data. Content type will represent in which format client giving the input. Accept will represent in which format client expecting the data. Here, REST API should have a flexibility to choose input and output data formats for the clients. Media type representation. You should give the accessibility for the client. They can send XML data or they can send JSON data. They can take XML data as output. They can take JSON data as a output. Like this, media type representation should be followed in your REST API. REST stands for representation state to transfer. So whenever you are developing the REST API, you need to follow client server architecture. You need to follow client server architecture. No state and session management. Every request should be considered as a first request in the REST API. And you need to have unique addressability. Every REST API method should be identified with a unique address. Map the REST API endpoints to HTTP methods. Get, post, put, delete. So depends on the requirement. You can map your REST API method to HTTP methods. If you don't map your methods to HTTP methods, can anyone access your REST API method? Client can access your method or client cannot access your method? Guys, can client access our method? Client cannot access our method. If you don't map our methods to proper HTTP request method. If you don't map your method to HTTP request method, client can access or client cannot access? Clients cannot access. And in your REST API, you need to have media type representation. What is the meaning of a media type representation? You should support for multiple formats of input data, multiple formats of output data. That is called as media type representation. Media type representation. REST architecture principles. Client server architecture, no session management in the REST APIs, unique addressability, map REST API endpoints to HTTP methods, media type representation consumes, produces, content type and accept. Client is having the flexibility. And there is another concept in the REST architecture principles, which is called HTOs. There is another concept called HTOs. Hypermedia as a engine for state transfer. So here, whenever we are developing REST API should generate the response in the hypermedia format. REST API should generate the response in the hypermedia format. Sir, what is the meaning of this HTOs? What is the hypermedia? When we go for data REST, that HTOs is a inbuilt concept. When you go for data REST concept, HTOs is a inbuilt concept, guys. Okay, now let us see what is that HTOs, how the HTOs response will come. When your REST API is handling a request, it has to provide hyperlinks in the response to access the further details. Now, localhost colon 8080 slash localhost colon 8080 slash what is the REST resource path I have given? Let me go for book repository. REST resource path is books. Localhost colon 8080 slash books. Okay. Now see, I'm getting the response. When I get the response, do you think that only my book name and book price is coming, or the links also coming in the response? The links also coming in the response. Whenever we send a request, the REST API should provide the response along with the hyperlinks. Okay. If you want to access all the books, then you need to go for /books URL. To get all the links, to get all the projects, all the records, go for /books. If you want to search the books, then you go for search URL pattern. If you want to get the particular book, then go for that book ID. So it is providing the response in the hypermedia format. So this is called Hetios principle. So here, when we are using Spring Data REST repository, do I need to do anything for the Hetios, or I no need to do anything for the Hetios? Do I need to do anything for the Hetios, or I no need to do anything for the Hetios? It is coming by default. If you are developing normal REST controller, then you need to implement Hetios and you need to send response along with the hyperlinks. So here, if the REST API want to send the response along with the hyperlinks, then it has to go for Hetios, hypermedia as a engine. Hypermedia as a engine to represent state. Hypermedia as a engine to represent the state. So here state, that means the data, whatever the data that we want to send in the response, that we are going to send in the hypermedia format. That is called Hetios. Okay, guys. So here to implement Hetios in the data REST, you no need to do anything. Blindly, if you send the request to the URL pattern, the REST resource path, it is giving the response along with the hypermedia format. For example, in the normal application, if you want to implement the Hetios, then we need to add Hetios dependency in the pom.xml. Tomorrow, I will show you how to implement Hetios in our REST API. This is famous interview question. What is a Hetios in the REST API? How you develop a REST API with the Hetios. Tomorrow, we will do one example on the Hetios. Good. Anybody having any questions? Anybody having any questions on this as of now?
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, when we are using controller only, without a response body,
Yes.
there is also no state management, na, sir?
No, that is what you should not implement that.
Okay.
They are telling that you should not implement. If you go for normal controller, session management is not there. If you want, in the web application, you can implement session management. But in the REST API, you should not do that. That is what they are telling.
Okay.
REST API means every request should be considered as a fresh request.
Okay, understood. Means this is a protocol like that.
Right. It is a recommendation.
Okay.
Yeah. Fine, guys. So with this, I'm stopping for today. So tomorrow we'll develop one application with the Hetios principle. We'll see you in the tomorrow's class. Please practice exception handling before coming to tomorrow class. Thank you, guys.